Hello and welcome to Argonne at Lunch. My name is Justin, bro. Today we have a special show for you today. We have Tricia, Bobeda and Greta Johnsen from the Nerd App Podcast, which is on WBEZ. And I just want to say thank you to you ladies. Thank you for coming out today.
Thank you for having us. It's been super fun.
Excellent. You know, we just had a fun-filled day, so we're talking to researchers all day. We spoke to Catherine Riley, who is over in the Argonne Leadership Computing Facility. We talked to Raja Sankaran, who is working on the Array of Things Waggle program. So, how has your day been so far?
This is so much fun for us as science geeks to get to see Argonne up close. Neither of us have ever been to the facility before. So, just getting to see science in action as we're walking through the halls has been exciting. And of course, the two folks you just mentioned who we're talking to were really generous and so good at explaining to us what it is that their area of work is trying to do. Not just, day to day, but the bigger picture problems you all are trying to solve here at Argonne. So that's been fascinating to hear about.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think so often it's almost difficult to fathom what all happens at a facility like this. So to get to walk around and talk to folks, for sure. So it's just, it's been really fun.
Excellent. So I'm already initiated, so these ladies work for WBEZ. So do one of you want to take the question is, what is WBEZ?
Yes, WBEZ is Chicago's public radio station. We are affiliated with NPR, which is National Public Radio, and that means we air some of their programs and some of our own programs. And essentially, we are funded by the public. The majority of our funding comes from just a whole bunch of different listeners who give whatever they are able to make this thing happen. That means we are nonprofit journalism, which is something that I think is super important in this day and age and into the future.
Excellent. So, Tricia, I'm going to start off with my first question with you. Where did the idea for the Nerd App Podcast come from?
So Greta and I were both working at WBEZ in different jobs, and neither of us was getting a lot of chances to interview people, which is something we both really like to do, just to get to sit down and ask people questions. And so we were talking about the fact that we listened to a lot of podcasts and realized that most of them, pretty much almost all of them, were hosted by only men. And so the conversations that we were sort of getting to eavesdrop on when it came to science, technology, pop culture that we loved, we felt like there was a perspective missing from that conversation, and one that we wanted to try to help bring to the space. And that was about 4 years ago. We started making a weekly show where at its heart, each week, it's a conversation with somebody who's fascinating and doing fascinating things and trying to just sort of figure out what inspires them, hear more about the work that they're doing, and it's everyone from astronauts to authors to comedians to scientists at Argonne, and we do that every week with WBEZ here in Chicago, and it's so much fun because every single week we get to talk to somebody new, because for us, nerd isn't a noun, it's a verb, so it's not about what you love, it's about how much you love it.
I love it.
And that is something that means that we can always find a new fascinating person to talk to each week.
That's excellent. For Greta, why did you pursue journalism? What was the drive?
So I remember being a sophomore in high school in my advanced English class, and someone came in and talked about this extracurricular journalism program they were going to do in my school district. And I remember thinking, this is how I can study all the things at once. Because I was really interested in science, I was really interested in art, I was really interested in art history, I was really interested in philosophy, and I wasn't quite sure, thinking about college, what I was actually going to study and pursue. And it was that moment.
So most undergrads.
Of thinking, for sure. It was that moment of thinking this is how I can wrap it all into one delicious burrito that got me thinking about journalism. And I didn't actually study journalism until graduate school. I studied English Lit in college, which is still at its core storytelling.
How do you think that English Lit informed your journalistic style?
I think it's all about stories. I think it's all about finding what makes people tick and talking to them about it. And I think that is at the core of any really good story.
Okay, I'm going to ask you this just because I was a philosophy major. Who's your favorite philosopher?
Oh my gosh. Let's go Kant.
I'm an Aristotle, but that's okay. It's cool.
Fair enough.
It's cool. Tricia, what are you currently nerding out on?
So right now, I and a very small group of dedicated people on the internet, we are all watching a show on Netflix called Travelers. The season 2 just came out.
That's on Netflix, though.
Yeah. I feel like it's just me and 6 really awesome people on Twitter who seem to be maybe the only ones watching the show. But here's what I love about this show, and it's reminding me of today, is it's a show about humans using technology to try to solve their problems and how that's always a double-edged sword. Because technology and discovery always mean that we're amplifying, I think, the best and the worst instincts we have. Okay. So something that can cure a disease could also be created as a weapon, right? We always have this double-edged approach to discovery that I think is good to keep in mind as technology changes the way we live, the way we communicate. And Travelers is sort of a fun, campy, to be honest, example of that playing out, where humans and technology are at odds, but really the humans are always at fault in these stories, right?
Of course, because we're only human. So how many seasons are we in so far?
So the second season just dropped over the holidays, and I binge watched it, so, no spoilers for the rest of you. But if you're somebody who likes science and likes thinking about that question of how technology is changing us.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, you're in the perfect place for that type of thing. Greta, in your opinion, how has news reporting changed in the past 10 years?
I think it's changed a lot over the past 10 years. I mean, especially when you think about social media, like just how the world has changed over the past years, and like with the interwebs, like the entire thing has completely shifted, wouldn't you say?
I think, the speed at which people expect information is changing, right? And people want an on-demand experience, so they want to know exactly what they're looking for, sort of a call and response approach to news, as opposed to the newspaper drops on your doorstep in the morning and this is sort of a fully formed idea. And I think also, though, that in some ways journalism hasn't changed, because journalism has the same core principles behind it that I hope it always will have, which is that trust is the most important thing that we think about when we're going out as journalists at WBEZ, is that the audience has a fire hose of information coming at them online all day long. But what do you trust? Who do you trust? And so those are questions we take very seriously, and it's why we do things like quadruple check the facts before we put things out. It's why we do things like call that one more person to see if we're getting it right, or if we can explain it a little better, make it a little more accessible. So those extra steps that journalists take to make sure that the information is accurate, that it's fair, that it's helping drive a conversation that we all should be having about issues that we're all facing. I think that at its core, when it was just a couple of people, in a town square handing out a leaflet, and 50 years from now, when it's all in a chip in our brains, like the core of a journalist's job is going to stay the same, and that is to always approach questions that you think your community has and hope that they can trust you to do a good job trying to find answers that are as accurate as possible, as nuanced as possible.
So you're basically scientists, basically.
Journalism and science have so much in common in that regard. Absolutely.
When I think about all the scientists that we have here, they check and they triple check, and they have college check and they triple check just to make sure it's right, and then they get to submitting it to where they can have a whole nother barrage of other people checking what they're checking.
I think, too, we spend a lot of time testing out hypotheses, like what is the cause of this problem, and who can we call to see if that actually is accurate or not,
So one of the programs that you had just recently was with Brooke Gladstone, and it was a Star Trek episode, which, if the viewers don't know, I'm just a big Star Trek, not Star Wars fan, but that's a conversation for another.
I don't think it has to be either or. I would like to say that.
But anyway, so Brooke Gladstone, she mentioned in this episode where she was sitting around with her family, but she brought up a study in this particular episode where the study pit science fiction writers against futurists, and who could most accurately depict what is to come. And it came out that the science writers were more accurate, the science fiction writers were more accurate than the futurists, and one of the reasons was because the futurists had based what they were thinking was to come too much into what we're saying, extrapolating from what was known. What does that say about science today and our ability to conceive of what is to come?
I think when we were talking this morning about how you decide what question to ask a supercomputer, this kind of came up too, is you have to articulate and pose the right question to get an answer that's meaningful. And so the example I would use is that if you think about science one way, you could come up with the best iron lung in the world, but you would never get the polio vaccine. Right, so you could keep iterating and improving on and tweaking the thing that is known, the thing that exists, but that has a limit. And if you instead create a space for true discovery, you can come up with a completely different solution to a problem than you can imagine based on looking at the current situation. And I think that's what a fiction writer is encouraged to do. And in many scientific settings, I think perhaps folks are based on, a very specific discipline or a very specific objective that's been sort of handed down to them. They maybe are focused in on something that's very specific, making a better iron lung. Whereas there needs to be then that space for creating the polio vaccine.
or just knowledge in general, because I think that's what national labs are really, really good at, is just understanding the fundamentals. Do we understand honestly what water is? Do we understand what these elements are?
Questioning all those assumptions.
Questioning the assumptions and creating new knowledge to make the innovations of the future.
Yeah, I think that fiction also occupies a really interesting space in that question. I think about something like, I don't know if you're familiar with the genre cli-fi that has kind of emerged in the last 5 to 10 years, but the idea is that it's science fiction oriented around the idea of climate change. And so the stories, will involve deserts that used to be super lush solely because there is no more water. And I think that's another space where things can really be explored theoretically to help people understand concepts that are just too difficult to grasp otherwise, like something like climate change.
And again, it comes back to the story.
Exactly, yeah.
All right, so I'm sorry, we switched this. So Greta, what types of stories are you interested in telling and why?
I think I hinted at it earlier, but to me the stories that I'm most interested in telling involve talking to people about what they are most excited about. And it also, for me, involves talking to as many different kinds of people as possible with as many different experiences as possible, partly just for the sake of representation and helping, little girls or people of color or, any kind of person be able to see someone and say, I want to be that, and have it be entirely possible. That, to me, is what's really exciting.
Can you pick out a story that you expressly like?
That I have done,
you really had
or
a
that
great interview and you thought,
oh
this
my
was
gosh,
a great story. There's too many.
I should have a better answer for what my favorite is, because there are just so many good ones. I think Eugenia Chang is a really excellent example of an interview that we did. She is kind of like she has how many PhDs? At least several. She's a mathematician.
Every PhD, more than
I think she's got. But she also, wrote a book about how cooking is affected by math, and is just, so accessible and funny and sharp and extremely smart at the same time. And I think that's just so much fun to engage with and inspiring for people to listen to.
And she's been taking her knowledge of mathematics and taking it into an artistic setting, working with folks at the Art Institute. And so thinking about the idea that 1 + 1 doesn't equal 1 in mathematics, but 1 + 1 does equal 1 when you're dealing with color. Because when you combine two colors, you just get a single new color. Right, that's Eugenia Chang. It's someone who's thinking about, again, in this interdisciplinary way, encouraging interdisciplinary thought, I think is something that she does that discovery requires.
That's amazing. That's amazing. All right, let me recover from that. Okay. Tricia, what types of stories, I'm reading, so pardon me. Researchers here and other places, they want their research published. So my question to you is, what makes something newsworthy?
So you mean how to get press attention for work that's been done? That's a great question, and there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, because every, we often, in the same way that we hear about, the media as a blanket term, I think too often, there's not like a single press release you can write that's going to, get the person who works at Marketplace and a cable TV news channel and a newspaper all to decide this is right for our audience at this moment. There's going to have to be a tailored approach. And so I think that one of the things as a journalist I often think about is my job is to try to think about the user, the person in my community first, and the questions they have. And so if the work you're doing can be boiled down to how it's affecting everyday people, either today or how it may in the future, that's always going to be interesting to me, both selfishly as humans, right? We want to know, what does it mean for me? But as a journalist, then my job is to say, what does that mean for my community? I'm trying to catch people up on things that are new, and I'm trying to help them understand better things that are going on. Those are two of the jobs I think about myself doing day to day as a journalist. So if it's just brand new and there's that sort of novelty of, like, stop the presses, we didn't know this before and we know this now. That's
happens a lot.
That's the catch me up moment of, like, people need to know that this happened, but then they also need to know the next step of help me understand why that matters. What could it mean 10 years from now in terms of curing disease or changing the way we live in cities or any of these things. And so, you don't have to do all of that work as the researcher who wants to communicate, but thinking about the fact that that's actually my goal as a journalist, is actually just like your neighbor understanding this. And so if you can think about how to explain it to your neighbor when you're at a backyard barbecue, that's the version of the story that's going to most resonate with a journalist, because that's their job too.
Yeah, I would say I think about three things. I think about impact. I think about how many people can be impacted by this. I think about immediacy, like how, if it's super far down the line, that's maybe super interesting, but not necessarily as important to put in like an afternoon newscast.
Right.
And I think about what's at stake. And I think especially the stakes in any news story are really important to consider. And that goes back to impact too, right? It's like how many people could this affect? And I think, if you can get real people who could be impacted by this too, right? Whatever the discovery is, if it's a new treatment for some kind of disease, if you can find a person who has that disease who can talk to why this could really change things, I think that helps a lot too.
That's excellent. So we just spoke a little bit about what makes science newsworthy, and we just came to the conclusion it's not a one-size-fit-all type of deal. You have to be tailored in your approach. But my next question, this is for both of you. Tips for scientists in communicating. So we talked about what makes something newsworthy, but as a scientist, a researcher, necessarily you're focused on your science and you're not necessarily taking communications classes. So any tips and tricks for scientists that do want to get their messages out there and how to best do that?
I think what you just said about the backyard barbecue to your neighbor thing is actually super huge.
Yeah, I think in the formal or informal training that journalists go through, and this is actually something that the show Planet Money and Robert Smith and those folks I think do really well, because they take big, complicated, sometimes maybe on the surface dry economic ideas and bring them to life. You're constantly looking for an analogy.
Yeah.
And knowing that any analogy is imperfect and is going to be an oversimplification of the sort of vast amount of knowledge you as a scientist or researcher have, what is the analogy that can make that digestible for me so I now have a framework to work from? And now that I have a framework that works, because I have your analogy and we're sort of humming along, now you can sort of drill into more detail, and I can sort of keep sort of hanging those on the tree that we've built as elements that will help me understand it further. But that's a thing that when we as journalists are trained how to translate things that are very technical into that more accessible backyard barbecue conversation, we're looking for analogies, we're looking for ways to tell a story or an anecdote that represents not the specifics but the idea, the principle at play. And so finding those for your own work is going to be a great thing to have in your back pocket, probably as you're looking for press attention, but also just to have those conversations with friends and family, and maybe hypothetically to be able to articulate better to a funder or someone else who you need to understand your work.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think often it's less about the tree than it is about the forest. And I think often when people are just studying trees really closely, it's hard for them to take kind of that 10,000 or 30,000 foot view. And I think that's often what's super important, is to get a sense of the landscape of the forest before honing in on the branch of one specific tree.
Sure. A couple tips for you.
There's an analogy.
Yes, there's another analogy. Remember, the forest, not the trees. Not necessarily. Just make sure you know where you're looking at what time. We got it. So my last question for you, do you suggest any particular type of social media? So myself, I work here at Argonne as a social media manager. So we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on Google+, we're on LinkedIn, and soon to be Instagram, so just stay tuned for that. But have you found any particular social media that works really well for your ability to put messages out into the public?
So the way I think about this a lot is that social media and sort of ways of communicating digitally especially, you can think of in a couple different ways. So there's that sort of big red set of tools that you can buy that like some people have in their garage, where it's like the 500 tool chest, right? Where it's like you have 50 wrenches in this drawer, and then you got 100 hammers, and then you got, I don't know. But it's like, okay, so that's pick your, Pinterest, Instagram, Snapchat. They're all these different tools. Well, but they actually all do, in some cases, similar work. So I prefer a sonic screwdriver approach, and that is a Doctor Who reference.
She just nerded out. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
So you want to pick sort of one tool that you're going to have with you all the time and use consistently enough that you know how to use it well, and it's going to do the job that you more specifically know you want to do, right? And so instead of carrying around 500 tools, just pick one or two, or just have a couple of priorities, because social media technology is really just an entry point into a different conversation in a different community. So each one has its own etiquette, its own rules of engagement. One of the things I think I would most clearly state is just sort of not effective is taking a one-size-fits-all approach again and just sort of blasting in a broadcasting promotional sense the same information the same way across all those different channels.
So no, if you have a Facebook and a Twitter and an Instagram, don't put the same message on each one.
Because somebody who likes you enough to follow you in multiple places then is kind of getting spammed, right? So one of the things we do is try to pick sort of a single task for each platform on the ones that are maybe more specific. So Greta does something on our Instagram that is an example of this.
Yeah, I take pictures of the covers of books that I've read or want to read.
Nice.
And that's pretty much it, which is great for Instagram because it's such a visual medium, and book covers are usually nice to look at. And it can be like a stack of books that I'm looking forward to read in January, or, a book at a bookstore that I think looks good. And that's a fun way. And then, the comments will be people saying like, oh my gosh, I read that, you're going to love it, or I can't, now I'm buying this myself. And that's been a really fun way to engage and have a conversation in a way that we just can't on the podcast, because we're actually talking back and forth with people.
And in any of these instances, if you're not willing to also take the time to authentically be a part of a conversation, don't do it, right? Like don't add a account for each of these things just to broadcast. They're not broadcast tools, they're conversational tools. And so, the time, if you're thinking about how to bake in time as an organization, as an individual for those interactions, it's not just I'm writing 3 tweets today. It should be occasionally I'm also going to share something someone else has done. I'm also going to respond to a question a colleague in this space has thrown out. Because if you're not also sometimes giving, it's not going to be a fruitful experience. People are going to see it as just sort of a feed. It may as well be at that point an RSS feed of your press releases, if that's all you're doing.
I think you can do the same with asking questions too.
Absolutely.
That's a fun way of.
And that's the analogy I come away. Well, it's not an analogy, but the idea I come away with. Everybody's we are a very academic society, especially here at Argonne. A lot of academics, and a lot of time we're just very used to that one-sided or one-way communication. Mm-hmm. You sit in that class, and somebody teaches you, and that's the way you're supposed to learn. Whereas social media, it just breaks those rules, right? Because it's one-on-one. It's you give me something, I'll take something. It's that.
The Socratic method.
Indeed.
She just nerded out too. So that I'm going to end it there. You've been watching Argonne at Lunch. Thank you very much. This is Greta Johnsen and Tricia Bobeda. They are hosts of the Nerdette podcast, soon to come out. And thank you for joining us.